למסתננים יש ברירה פשוטה, לשתף איתנו פעולה ולצאת מרצון בדרך מכובדת, בדרך אנושית ובדרך חוקית. או כמובן נצטרך להפעיל את הכלים האחרים העומדים לרשותנו, גם הם לפי החוק. אני מקווה שיבחרו לשתף איתנו פעולה.
Deportation or detention, an ultimatum put forth by the Israeli government, part of a long campaign to push African asylum seekers out. Human rights groups say the move is in violation of international refugee law and puts the lives of thousands from Eritrea and Sudan in danger. And the head of the UN Refugee Agency, Filippo Grandi, has said Israel must not forget its own painful history of migration and exile.
There are 38,000 asylum seekers here. Israel has the capacity to accept them, to integrate them, and instead is paying a poorer country to take its small share of refugees, a country like Rwanda, which is already hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees.
There had been reports that Rwanda and Uganda had agreed to take in some of the refugees. But those two countries now deny any such agreement was ever made. Israel's government says its plan is humane and voluntary, despite the fact that those who refuse to leave could face indefinite detention. Hundreds of African refugees in Israel are currently being held in the Hot Lot Detention Center, which is expected to close later this year. For refugees who have managed to find work and learn the language, there have been other government maneuvers to get them to leave. Last year, the government implemented a tax plan to take away 20% of their wages, which they can later access only if they leave Israel.
They call it voluntary, but involuntary. If you press someone and to leave your country, it is not voluntary, it's involuntary. You make his life very hard and hard from day to day. So he leaves the country. It's not voluntary. So they want us to leave the country because of our skin.
Critics of the campaign say it's racially motivated because its advocates perceive African migrants as a demographic threat. Others say the timing is political, with corruption investigations against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ongoing and the possibility of early elections looming. But for those who will be affected, some say they'd rather go to jail than go back to their homeland. A vulnerability that's being ignored by a government that prefers to call African asylum seekers infiltrators. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Tel Aviv is Yigal Shtayem. He's an activist and co-founder of Soup Levinsky, an NGO that provides for refugees in Israel. Also joining us from Tel Aviv, we have Walpurga Engelbrecht. She's the representative for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Israel. And from Bridgetown in Barbados, we have Seth Frantzman. He's a journalist with the Jerusalem Post. I thank you all for joining us. Walpurga, let me begin with you and get the UNHCR position on this. This idea that African migrants get some cash and a ticket to leave or they face time in jail. From your perspective, is that ethical? Is it moral? Is it humane? Is it legal?
I think the main issue is here to very much look at it. Who are these people who are being subject to relocation? And what is most important is that one needs to look first at the numbers. I mean, if we see how many are affected or how many Israel hosts currently, then we are talking about some 35,000 Eritreans and Sudanese by the end of September 2017, as announced by BIBA, the Ministry of Interior. And in previous times, there were some 55,000 Eritreans and Sudanese, hence already some 20,000 departed through various means. And at the same time, if we look at it from an international law point of view, I think it's important to mention is that the order shifts the burden to third countries without meeting the required benchmarks. First, UNHCR is not necessarily in principle against the transfer of asylum seekers, provided it is burden sharing and not burden shifting.
Seth Frantzman, are you comfortable with them being labeled as infiltrators and treated like infiltrators?
No, I mean, I think, we go back to the history when up until 2013 or so, large numbers of people were crossing the Sinai. Many of these people had been victims of human trafficking, so they were kind of dumped on Israel's border. And they were part of a large migration of refugees and economic migrants who were trying to reach, most of them were trying to reach Europe. Very few of these people were not trying to reach Israel as a destination. They were the same people that ended up in Libya and ended up going across the sea. Some of them ended up in Turkey. So I don't think it's fair to label them infiltrators, probably, but I think it is fair to have a discussion about how many of them are refugees or asylum seekers or just economic migrants, and also to ask those people what they would like, where they would like to end up.
Yigal Shtayem, Netanyahu has a plan. It seems as if he has the democratic mandate behind this plan. There aren't tens of thousands of people out on the streets opposing this. If this is what the will of the majority want, who are you to fiddle with that?
First of all, I think Netanyahu is about to commit a crime in the name of the Israeli citizens. There's no doubt that while he is in pressure, he's under investigation on a few subjects. He is really keen to look for the love of even the right wing in Israel. He's meeting them, he's encouraging them, and of course, this horrible plan, this crime that's about to happen, deporting people, innocent people, that a very simple search in Google engine would tell you that they come from a dictatorship in Eritrea or from wars in Sudan. It's very easy to know. These people were not on their way to Europe. They just escaped anywhere they could. And by the way, they're not infiltrators. They got visa when they got through the Sinai Desert to Israel. Each and every one they have in their pocket a visa they have to stamp every two or 3 months. So they were accepted here, and the Israeli state that was founded as grandsons and granddaughters of Holocaust survivors should be more sensitive about the fate of people who look for asylum.
Mm-hmm. So Seth, is Yigal guilt-tripping other Israelis by saying this is a country founded by Holocaust survivors, therefore we should do better? Or does he have a point in saying that this is a crime to send people back to countries like Eritrea, where things are not great?
As far as I know, almost none of them are being sent back to Eritrea. So I mean, actually, for several years, Israel had a very successful program in which I think 3,000 of them ended up moving to Canada. So I don't know what, he bases his data on in terms of whether or not these people want to stay in Israel.
That's not true.
Or whether they were searching to get to Europe.
Completely false.
No, I think in general, I mean...
There was no plan like that. It's completely false what you say.
As a country that based on Holocaust survivors, there's lots of people in Israel, including Arab citizens. So every country has a duty and a duty to take care of refugees.
Okay.
That's the whole purpose of the international law. I don't think Israel has some special responsibility. I think countries that committed the Holocaust, like those countries, by the way, probably have a more special responsibility.
Let me ask Yigal.
Of course we
Yigal,
do.
tell me why you said what Seth.
Tell me responsible about it.
Okay, tell me why you think what Seth said is false. He's saying people aren't being sent back to Sudan or Eritrea. That's false. He's saying they're going to places like Canada.
No. There's no plan for immigrants, for asylum seekers in Israel towards Europe. They're getting jailed here without trial. They're getting persecuted in the streets. They're not allowed to work. I worked with them for the last 6 years. I know what I'm talking about. I think what's the Netanyahu's plan is just going to be the worst of the last 10 years. These people deserve to be treated in the human rights standard, a different one, especially in Israel. And it's completely false. Nobody allowed them to get to the whole idea of the third country is an imagination of Netanyahu. There was Rwanda and Uganda, both countries, said there's no agreement for people, asylum seekers to get there.
Let me ask.
Somebody is trying to get rid of people.
Okay, good point. Let's ask Valpurga from the UNHCR, because maybe she'd be able to shed some light on this. There was a suggestion that there was a deal with third-party countries, Rwanda, Uganda, they both came out and said, hey, there's no deal whatsoever. We're not taking anybody. So what is going on? Is there a deal or is there no deal, Walpurga?
Unfortunately, I cannot provide the necessary clarification since UNHCR has not been party or privy to any of the specifics of the agreements. We only learned ourselves about agreements in the media where initially the foreign minister came out and said, yes, indeed, that they are in discussions with Israel in order to receive an increased number of relocatees from Rwanda. However, the latest statement from the deputy foreign minister is saying, no, we don't have such an agreement. We can only say that based on past relocations to these two countries and the interviews we have been able to conduct with some of the relocatees certainly provide some confirmation that there is some form of an agreement between Israel and the countries as for the past. As for the future, it is not clear, as I just mentioned before.
Yigal, is the policy racist?
Of course it is. You know, the smallest group of immigrants in Israel are these asylum seekers from Eritrea and Sudan. They're about 0.004 of the population. Now you have about 10 times bigger groups that nobody is trying to deport at all. Now, the way Israel does this, I'm ashamed to say this because I would like my country to treat people better, is just not checking their request for asylum. They just don't check it. Same people from the same group, from the same countries get about 85% of them. They get to be refugees in Europe. How come in Israel is a zero? It must be racist. There's no other reason.
Seth Franzman, one of the Eritrean asylum seekers...
I'm sorry to say this.
Interesting. I mean, one of the Eritrean asylum seekers featured in our report preceding the discussion, Teklit Michael, said, quote, they want us to leave the country because of our skin. This is the only point. Seth, they feel if they were Norwegian or if they were white, it would have been a different story altogether. It's because they're black and African, that's why Israel wants to get rid of them. Is there any truth to that, Seth?
Look, I think there is certainly a lot of incitement and racist things that have been made by politicians over the years. So there's clearly a degree of racism. But I also know, just in personal experience in Israel, also that if you're European or you want to basically live in Israel and you're a Christian or you think it's interesting, they also make it very difficult for you. I think Israel in general makes it very, very difficult for foreigners. I think there's also a certain level of racism as an incitement, specifically targeting these 37,000 African migrants and refugees. And by the way, the numbers, I think, are not correct. If Israel's a country of 8 million, these people are about half of 1%.
Okay.
So it's not a tiny number. If you compared it to Europe, it would be equivalent to 4 million people or something.
And Seth, if somebody from the outside looks in and says, yes, sure, Israel defines itself...
What's the danger of keeping them here?
Hold on, just for a second, Seth, and we'll get that answered in a second. Just a second, Yigal. Seth, if somebody from the outside looks in and says, okay, fair enough, Israel defines itself as a Jewish state, but what does that mean when Benjamin Netanyahu says too many African migrants will threaten our Jewish character? How is that not the same as somebody who's maybe a white nationalist in Europe saying too many black people, too many Arabs, too many Muslims will threaten our white European Christian identity? How is it not the same as that?
I mean, I think in some ways it is the same as any country. For instance, whether it's Turkey or the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, for instance, doesn't take in all of the expats that live there.
Okay,
the local.
Okay, but that's the UAE.
People.
Yeah, and then the UAE has a very unfair policy, and that's. I mean, we can discuss that in the policy, right?
I think Israel also has an unfair policy. I mean, I think that it would be great. It would be great if Israel were to say, okay, we're going to take 5,000 or 10,000 and give them citizenship, and we're going to encourage the other 20,000 that remain, if they'd like, to move somewhere else, especially in the West, where perhaps they would prefer to live. So I think it would be great if Israel took in a certain percentage of them.
But is Netanyahu taking the Jewish identity as an excuse for a form of racial supremacism?
I don't know about racial supremacism, but I mean, Israel is defined as or looks at itself as a Jewish state. and it tends to not take in large numbers of refugees or asylum seekers. That's the nature of Israel, and I think that's certainly the nature of this government, and I think also previous governments, by the way, which didn't take in very few, almost any.
So Yigal, you have all these high hopes for the wrong country. This is the nature of Israel, according to Seth.
First of all, that's basically not true. About a third of the population is Arab Israelis, okay? And 75% only are Jewish. I mean, first of all, this is not a Jewish country. We accepted as a country so many people, so many minorities from all around the world. So it's not a Jewish state per se. That's first thing I want to say. Second thing is, how come so many other immigrants from other countries are left alone? Nobody's deporting them. How come Israel is bringing people to work here from India, from all kinds of places, and they have problems with these specific people that are asylum seekers? It makes you wonder, how come Netanyahu uses these people that were hated so much by racists? How come he supports them? What's becoming of Israel by having this crazy plan of deporting them even by force? I have to say, I knew people that were deported here and didn't survive, including kids that were deported from Israel in 2014 to Sudan. Kids I knew, and they didn't survive.
Valpoga, let me ask you, I mean, and that's harrowing to hear. Valpoga, if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called you in, sat you down and said, okay, how can I do this better? What would you suggest to him?
We would certainly suggest as UNHCR to focus on positive solutions. As UNHCR, in cooperation with the international community, we can work together. We can see how, through more positive solutions, be it resettlement, be it support of sponsorship programs such as being offered by Canada, or support of family reunion, where a family member has been granted refugee status in one of the European countries and would like to reunify, to work on these solutions, but in turn actually then see for those where a third country solution is not possible, to provide improved protection until these persons can return in safety and dignity.
Okay, well, those are the hopes, and the deadline has been set, end of March. This is when the African migrants and refugees have until they either accept the deal or go to jail. We'll be keeping a close eye on the story here on the Newsmakers. But for the moment, I thank you all. Seth Franzman, Yigal Shtayem, and Valpoga Engelbrecht. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.